everybody. And I'm excited to have Kevin Franciotti and Todd Youngs. And we're exploring, what do we title this again? Addiction or recovery in a psychedelic light. So, Kevin, can you start and we'll do a little background, a little bio, let people know who you are and your work.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Kevin Franciotti. I am based in New York City. Currently, I'm working as a full-time addiction counselor in an adolescent rehab under the old school therapeutic community model. For any of you who are familiar with models of addiction treatment, it has evolved quite dramatically since the early days of that approach, but I won't dwell too much on my current job at the moment. My background briefly is, as an undergrad, I studied behavioral neuroscience at Northeastern, and during that time I also co-founded a Students for Sensible Drug Policy chapter, and through that chapter we hosted the Boston Ibogaine Forum in 2009, an international conference over the weekend, President's Day. And also I was, for a brief time, a research assistant at a lab at Harvard's McLean Hospital doing an MDMA for cancer anxiety study. I got to witness the first participant in that study go through the entire experimental protocol. In the meantime, between 2009 and today, it would be exhaustive to go through everything, obviously, but my personal struggles began to stumble and interfere with my professional ambitions, let's put it that way, and really took the rug out from under me. And I spent a couple of years in a worsening downward spiral of my own addictions, specifically to opiates and intravenous heroin, which was only successfully arrested when I went to Mexico to take Ibogaine in 2011. And ever since then, really my path in recovery was foremost in my mind. And I had a relapse a couple of years ago, and am now like fully back on track, recovered from that, and back on the path. So I'm sure I'll dive deep more into some aspects of my story and my background and all of that. But for now, I think that suffices for a concise enough intro.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. And how about you, Todd?
Okay, well, I am recovering these last nearly 11 years from multiple addictions. I was alcoholic, addicted to opiates, heavy user of cocaine and crack, with a smattering of methamphetamine and considerable amounts of benzodiazepine use. And so I'm 52 now. I got clean when I was 42. And so my path up until the time I was 42 was pretty much, it was a downward spiral over a long period of time. And, you know, collapsed veins, missing teeth, many trips to jail, prison, treatment centers. One could say I was very effectively making a large mess out of my life for a long time. And then in 2009, I had the opportunity to start drinking ayahuasca within ritually guided ceremonies, and use that in conjunction with 12-step therapy. And here I am today. I am now a recovery coach. I'm involved in recovery community more broadly. I'm a member of the Santo Daime spiritual path, as well as other paths. And also now I'm a consultant for Project New Day in California, which is a new foundation whose mission is to bring some of the more pioneering aspects to the field of addiction recovery. So that psychedelic experiences, for instance, can be normatized and introduced into that in a sort of infrastructure-like way. So that's kind of what I'm up to. And I live in Seattle, by the way. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to have you guys on here today. This is I think a really important topic. I personally know some folks that have been in the recovery community that have used psychedelics, especially like ayahuasca, and really trying to approach this work to heal, and have kind of gotten, either shamed or kicked out of the communities in a sense. And I don't know, maybe it's that reframing of these are different types of substances, but I don't know. How do you guys look at this, knowing that they are quote unquote drugs? And I know the whole maybe purpose is to abstain from any substance.
Yeah, I think, the really interesting thing, and Kyle, I know you have a background in holotropic breath work and the Groff model of having I'll probably butcher the phrasing for this, but kind of an internal propensity towards wholeness, that people have this intrinsic healing nature from within them that have identified, and researchers and shamans and community civilizations long before us understood that different types of medicines kind of activated different aspects of that healing component, and not necessarily medicines. They are catalysts for an experience, an experiential quality that drives that healing. So the really fascinating thing is, I'm sure I can speak for Todd here as well, but I didn't discover anything of this, and the truly awe-inspiring thing was that the more people I've met in different spectrums of recovery, whether that's a harm reduction approach, an abstinence approach, or any kind of sort of self-identified recovery lifestyle, that have discovered psychedelics as a separate component from drugs of abuse or their drug of choice, they seem to have gone through a very similar internal negotiation process, where they may have approached psychedelics with caution after becoming abstinent or entering a recovery lifestyle. But at some way along the line, there was a separation between something that was more of a self-destructive component and something that facilitated a healing quality. So we just, for myself, I can sort of recognize both. And I have met people anecdotally that for sure can qualify for having like habitual substance use disorder type behavior involving psychedelics. And it's, again, because of this experiential component, not necessarily like the neurobiology and the pharmacology of the drug effects themselves, but, so it really is a spectrum and individualized. But what encourages me and to move forward in doing this work and gathering people is that the similar pathway has been seen time and time again in others like me who in recovery have discovered a difference.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in on something Kevin said. So ayahuasca found me more than I found it. It came about almost serendipitously that, I had many dark hours through the 20 plus years that I was doing what I was doing. But then in what turned out to be my darkest hour, that's where the opportunity came, sort of like the cosmos provided to me. I don't want to sound too woo-woo, because then, I'm not really superstitious. I'm just kind of looking at the experience as it unfolded for me. And through the course of that experience, so many of the areas of resistance that I had to, hope being a single factor of mine as a really late stage alcoholic and addict, I did not have hope. I could not imagine life any differently, even though I really didn't even want to live life anymore. But then through the action of the ayahuasca, I was suddenly granted a glimpse of how things could be. And I was given some courage to actually follow a different path. And so kind of in a very short period of time, a lot of things that I'd been exposed to in treatment centers from many well-meaning people, but that I could not hear. I could not receive the kind of loving, caring, compassionate instruction and guidance I was getting from other people. All of a sudden, it kind of clicked for me. And I was like, oh, I can really do this. My life can be different. And that's not to say there was still a lot of hard work to do, but the whole shift in perspective, and going back to something Kevin mentioned about the Graph, the reference to what Carl Jung called the thirst of the soul for wholeness, I think is what I sought in addiction, although it was kind of like I was using the wrong fuel there. And when I finally discovered in the correct psychedelic space a different way of looking at things and a different perspective on myself and the world, everything kind of unfolded very naturally from there. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm curious if you guys you feel comfortable sharing, like, did you guys experiment with psychedelics while you were using? And then maybe if you were, how did things shift when it started to become more of a healing tool?
Well, growing up in the 1980s, I was self-described psychedelic warrior. You know, I was very much fascinated with the possibilities, you know, as a young man, 16, 17, 18, 19, even into my early 20s. I took a lot of primarily LSD and some mushrooms, also MDMA was making a big splash in the mid 80s, the first go around. And so I was pretty involved in all those things, but I didn't really have a path. And given that I was exposed to those things within a broader drug culture, it was difficult to find where the lines were. And my excessive taste for altered states, or curiosity for altered states, led me to smoke crack cocaine, which led to heroin, which led to a whole lot of other things, so my initial experiences with psychedelics may have inspired a lot of good thoughts in me. Lacking a path or some kind of direction, I found myself fairly vulnerable to a lot of the libertine tendencies that I had, and that got me into some serious trouble with other hard drugs of abuse, and also in my case, a serious alcohol abuse disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and you know, it's impossible to kind of discuss for me the relationship I've had with recreational drugs, or drugs deemed by our authoritative overlords as being Schedule 1 and the whole drug war mentality, without acknowledging like the vast sociocultural differences of growing up as a white kid in suburban Long Island with a middle-class family, you know, and the kind of privileges that afforded me. So I wouldn't be where I am today without a criminal record, with some of the behaviors that I've done, if it weren't for some of those privileges. I'm not going to say that everything was as a result of that, but I certainly would not have been treated the same doing a lot of the things that I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So to that end, most of my my discoveries of drug effects, and then my ongoing relationship with those drugs, was as a result of kind of rebellious teenage behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And discovering for myself just a lust for self-experimentation and a joy with hanging out with friends, drinking in some landfill in our town where we could be left alone, and then, you know, moving on to pot. But growing up, I had that mentality of, you know, there's a socially acceptable experimentation level with alcohol, unless you get too far. And
Mm-hmm.
then with all other drugs, there's no acceptable use. So growing up with that kind of educational introduction provided no use for when I actually started experimenting with it. I didn't know how to use safely. I didn't know the appropriate context. I didn't even know who to ask or where to go to get that information.
Mm-hmm.
I was just told that if you're going to choose to do that, and it is a choice, then you're on your own. At least, you know, maybe that those weren't specifically the lessons that were being given to me, but that's what I internalized. And so in that vessel of self-experimentation, it was really self-directed, and wherever my eyes or my attention darted towards, that's the lessons and resources that I was internalizing. So fortunately, I did come across some great information and some great resources, namely MAPS, the Arrowwood website, and, you know, I stayed away from like different drug using forums where I might have been exposed to misinformation, and I tried to go directly to the source as best as like a 17-year-old know-it-all can trust. But yeah, even my psychedelic use, but kind of came about in this, well, mushrooms and LSD are supposed to make you go crazy. Well, that sounds interesting. I want to try that. But through my, like, this internal barometer was just awakened when I was tripping, and when I discovered what the psychedelic state really offers, in that I was no longer interested in goofing off with my friends as much in those states. I was more interested in, like, I mean, I wouldn't say I was more interested. I was more surprised and caught off guard by feelings of affection towards like my family, and feelings of kind of guilt and shame and embarrassment from like the way that I was treating my loved ones in this rebellious process of mine. So just some kind of internal guide was always trying to like point me in the right directions. And at the same time, another kind of internal guide was also giving me more of like delusional fulfillment through different types of drug experiences. And before I forget, the last thing I wanted to touch on was Kyle, one of your first questions was asking about like the difference between, alcohol, opiates, cocaine, crack, meth, and psychedelics. And I think it's really the key difference for me was just the relationship difference. And I could hear my friend Dimitri Mugianis in the back of my mind, reminding everyone of his affinity for opiates and how helpful of a teacher the opium poppy plant was. And I can attest to the fact that whatever my experiences were at the time, whatever drive I had towards the opiate experience, maybe was necessary for me at that time. It's shocking to use verbiage like that because I could be in jail, I could be dead. So to say those things are necessary is somewhat absurd. But at the same time, there were feelings of relief that I was seeking something else from, and my ill-fated attempts to get that from outside of myself landed me on opiates, which provided some relief, but also a ton of destruction as a result.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think that just like speaks to the point that, sometimes people use substances as self-medication, right? Like it does have some sort of beneficial effect for some people when you are in those states, right? Either just trying to get away from some pain or, I think there is something too about kind of going out there and feeling that craziness, right? Gives us maybe a little bit of creativity at times, or just like a feeling of being alive. So do you have something to add, Todd? It seemed like you were going to say something.
Well, yeah, I think it is one of the things in my early psychedelic use, which continued through the drug use, the heroin using years also, interestingly, was that really I was looking for connection to something bigger. I mean, I had aspirations for greater connection to spirit, whatever I thought that was at the time, and to other people. But somehow there was at least for me, kind of an ego feeding aspect to psychedelics too, which were much more subtle. They made me feel, I kind of had this thought that I was becoming enlightened, right? And I liked that word. And I might have preached the gospel of peace and love, and I believe in those things, but somehow narcissism was creeping into my psychedelic use, which then made me very easy prey for hard drugs. Especially, I grew up in the Grateful Dead scene in the 1980s. And there was a noticeable shift when all of a sudden crack and heroin were all over that scene. And so we were all like sort of dancing in our psychedelic jungles. And then all of a sudden these dark forces, we allowed them in. And I think part of it had to do with the very subtle but then noticeable narcissism that at least I saw in myself. And then, so I just wanted to, make that point.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I mean, that is something that we do see at times, right? We talk about ego dissolution, but there can be a lot of ego inflation that happens with these substances. And I guess the reason why I was asking, where is that shift of like, more recreational towards this healing? I think, Kevin, you were saying something a little earlier about people maybe can overuse with psychedelics, like overuse it. And so, the first thing that popped in my head was spiritual bypassing. And I don't know, if necessarily it's all spiritual, maybe psychological bypassing as well. But yeah, where is that shift where it becomes maybe people are kind of overusing, overseeking, doing the spiritual, psychological bypassing to then shifting to being a little bit more conscious with it, or maybe approaching it with a little bit more intention of, oh no, there is a healing component here, and how do I make that conscious shift to use it that way?
Well, I think
that's such a great question. Go ahead, Todd.
I was just going to say, I think in my case, it was the perfect coalescing of the suffering that was the difference for me when I began using ayahuasca in a guided way. Was the suffering of my own choices had finally become so pervasive and so painful. Then that combined with the hope that I received, like it was the carrot and the stick, right? My addiction was kicking my butt and I couldn't stand the pain anymore. And then just in the nick of time, a ray of hope came through the ceremony. And so those two things working together sort of coalesced. into a total shift in my way of living and thinking. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough question, and I think it varies widely from person to person for sure. But I think when I look towards a different context for success, if you want to call it success, towards whatever someone is looking to achieve, if that's long-term behavioral change, if that's sustained periods of abstinence, or not simple, but sustained moderate use or less risky use, or really any kind of direction towards positive change, which is the simplest way of describing the harm reduction model, is what I would approach. But for me, the shift was more when I started to recognize the failure of overly relying on transient, temporary experiences as something that I could use to make myself feel better. So if I would say in college, like, have a mushroom experience where a lot of it was spent reflecting on how poorly I had been treating people in my life and my romantic partners, my teachers, people I would see on the street, really any kind of interpersonal interaction. If I felt flooded with guilt, I would eventually feel relieved from those emotional pains. And coming out of the experience, I'd be like, okay, good. I had that experience now. I've done my atonement. I've gone through the brief dark night of the soul, and now I'm out the other end feeling far more like fulfilled and ego reinforced, as Todd was mentioning. So until I similarly was really at a broken spiritual, physical, mental, emotional state, when I experienced Ibogaine, I had all of those similar themes going on, and the context was very different. I was at a clinic this time. I wasn't in my own bedroom or at a friend's dorm, or out in a park. Not that those things can't be healing, but I was clearly and consciously and intentionally seeking treatment, for lack of a better word, for my condition. And coming out of that, I again had very similar themes of tremendous guilt, tremendous shame, tremendous ecstasy, tremendous sorrow, and all the highs and lows that accompany a major psychedelic experience. And then coming out the other end, again, kind of feeling relieved, kind of feeling like I had done my atonement process, and now I was better. I also happened to be detoxed from opiates, so that's another like A plus. So now I just have like to approach my life with the full awakened, re-energized spirit that I had always done. Not so fast. I remember I had a deal with my family that since my broke, unemployable self couldn't pay for this treatment, I would offer to go straight into a halfway house if it was being funded by my family and supported. I tried to back out of that after my Ibogaine experience. I remember explicitly being on the phone with my mother and my brother, who were like, "You got to be kidding me! Like you're halfway across you're across on the other side of the continent right now, and you're trying to pull your way out of this." And fortunately, I came to my senses, and it could be some of the lingering spiritual afterglow state of being capable of making insightful redirections to myself, but following through on the commitments that I had made prior to it, and discovering a context for integration and a community of support with like-minded people is just so crucial. And that's where I think obviously this discussion is evolving towards with some of the work that Todd and I do. But in my personal journey, if I had never encountered community, if I had never encountered connection with others like me, and in the context of recovery, I don't think I would have fared as well if I had approached Ibogaine the same way that I was approaching it with other drugs.
Right. Yeah, and with that medicine, you might have to take a little bit more precautions, right? Seems a
Yeah.
little bit more intense at times. So I want to shift gears, I guess, a little bit. And this idea of maybe treating addiction with psychedelics seems like a new idea, but from a historical context, they were doing a lot of research with this. And I wonder if any of you can speak on some of the research that happened in the past with this, like LSD with alcoholism. And
Well, I mean, in the 1950s was a fertile period. Abraham Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond in Canada, Sidney Cohen in Los Angeles. So there was, I think, 1,000 peer-reviewed papers written on therapeutic applications of LSD. I'm not sure exactly how many of those were alcoholism specific, but there was robust evidence, at least in a preliminary sense, for the efficacy of sort of a psychedelic therapy. And in fact, and this is often asked of us, and it's fairly well known now that Bill Wilson, who was, co-originator of 12-step fellowships and process, was a fairly avid supporter of a lot of that work and had his own experiences with Sidney Cohen. And so there was a lot of, I think, optimism surrounding what the potential was to help. In that case, it was more specifically geared towards alcoholics, but then more, to more general way to addicts, addiction in general. So I think there's a good, sound history and track record that should inspire us. Now, I think, at least this is my reading of the history, was that the tumult of the 1960s and some of maybe the recklessness that occurred led some of the people that were doing that research to become a little concerned. Sidney Cohen, I know, was one that often reflected on what he thought were, reckless practices on the part of some younger psychiatrists and psychotherapists. That's just a little bit of trivia that I know. Go ahead, Kevin.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth also mentioning that a lot, if you look at the overall history of addiction treatment in like Western civilization, and there's some really great books like Slaying the Dragon is a fantastic historic overview of the whole history of alcohol treatment from the asylums to really modern times. And what is baffling is how little progress there has been made in that area, despite a lot of the news reports of the so-called opioid epidemic of today and a lot of the attention being given towards it. We are really not that much further ahead than we ever have been in mainstream medical treatment of addiction as a supposed disease, as recognized by the medical model. But the history of early 20th century psychedelic use and experimentation followed out from a model where they thought these experiences were mimicking psychoses. Mm-hmm. And at that time, it was a lot of difficult to treat conditions were basically relegated to this umbrella category of they might not have used the term psychosis, but it might as well have been as difficult a condition as the most extreme catatonic schizophrenics or severely autistic children who often were lumped together with what they were calling childhood schizophrenia. So these very, very difficult cases that were left to asylums and institutions basically to live out what low quality of life they may have while keeping people contained. When psychedelic experimentation from psychiatrists and psychologists and other people in medical professions came into fold, they were really, in many ways, kind of saying like, okay, well, we've tried all this stuff on all these really difficult to treat conditions. Let's try this new thing on them. And since alcoholism was such a poorly understood condition at the time, it was a natural kind of application for it. And people did approach, as Todd was pointing out, this work with intention and caution. And it wasn't just, throw drugs at people and see what happens. But the fact that they did discover a healing component for really difficult to treat alcoholics with LSD, with psilocybin, is a testament to how powerful a tool it could be and continues to still be. So when you look at the current state of clinical research and drugs that substance use disorders that we don't have pharmacological treatments for, like stimulant use disorder, or really alcohol use disorder has a couple, but the only the research is so early on, but very promising in those ways. So like the clinical randomized clinical trials are setting up hopefully a myriad of different types of ways to see these treatments happen, and whether or not it's going to be used for detox or quote maintenance therapy, or as a reinforcer for becoming more moderate in use, remains to be seen. But yeah, we are well due for a serious look at new ways to treat a variety of addictions, and this is one very exciting path that we're heading in.
Off the top of your head, do you know what type of research is happening right now in the realm of addiction and psychedelics?
Yeah, so I guess the leading institutions with psilocybin research based out of Johns Hopkins and NYU looking at substance use disorders are for alcohol in NYU, and they have Michael Bogenschutz is a psychiatrist that had a pilot study in his prior work in University of New Mexico that he's now basically working off of in his protocol to treat moderate alcohol use drinkers, or moderate to severe. Obviously, they have very strict like inclusion and exclusion criteria that are very difficult for a lot of people to qualify for. Like, I believe when I last looked at the protocol, they were looking for participants who were able to achieve 30 days of consecutive non-drinking days before they would qualify. So I'm sure you can imagine a severe alcohol drinker managing to go a whole month without drinking just to qualify for the study. That only attracts a certain type of person. But so Hopkins is also doing a lot of looking at nicotine use disorder. And I know Matthew Johnson has had a lot of success in his psilocybin trial. I believe there's also Peter Hendricks at University of Alabama at Birmingham that is doing a stimulant use disorder, primarily cocaine use with psilocybin. And the interesting thing with him, when I brought up kind of the racial disparity and the sociocultural dynamics here with psychedelics as often being understood as like an intellectual white person's pursuit. And with Hendrix's work, we get to see a new demographic, to put it bluntly, in largely low-income African-American cocaine and crack users that are enrolling in his study. And the good news is that, spoiler alert, it works for them too. So he is one of the few people that has a truly diverse pool of participants compared to some of the trials at Hopkins and NYU, which are enrolling higher educated, higher income demographics of folks. So I know there's University of Wisconsin at Madison, and I know also in the UK, there's Ben Sessa has been doing an MDMA assisted psychotherapy for alcohol use disorder, which I find really, really interesting, as MDMA has a lot of differences between the classic hallucinogen.
There's also another study being conducted by Brian Rush, who's an epidemiologist in Canada, in collaboration with Jacques Mabi down at Takawasi Center in Peru. It doesn't have a control group, primarily, I think, because they're working with ayahuasca, and because ayahuasca is a plant decoction, a lot of the regulating bodies of Canada, United States, or Great Britain, or even European countries don't necessarily feel all that comfortable. I mean, they may give deference to those kind of things, but in terms of creating a truly rigorous clinical trial, I think a lot of people are quite, queasy around using a plant decoction, which I reckon that the regulators see as somewhat, I don't know, like a little bit too ancient and hunter-gatherer technology or something.
I guess harder to control variables and stuff like that, maybe, for science.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and also because with ayahuasca, the alkaloid content of any given brew has variations because,
So
you know,
different.
right, there are 3 beta carbolines and then the one tryptamine, DMT. And each time it's brewed, there are slightly different alkaloid profiles to each, you know, each brew cycle. And so that makes it difficult to control.
Yeah. There's a question here. I don't think I know of any research or any researchers exploring amphetamine addiction. Do you guys know anything off the top of your head?
It seems,
No, there aren't any current clinical trials looking at that, but you know that's obviously just one lens to look at what people are researching or investigating. And with ibogaine, it does have very interesting neuropharmacological potential for meth abuse and the effects of meth on the brain and how damaging it can be to the dopaminergic pathways. There are limited like animal studies. There has never really been a lot of work in human models, but when you look at Stan Glick's, I think he was a University of Albany or somewhere in upstate New York medical researcher who did a lot of animal studies on rats to look at the ways that ibogaine heals a lot of the damaged cell pathways from meth, from an animal model of meth addiction.
Cool. Thank you. So yeah, where do you guys want to go now? I know you guys had something outlined and I maybe went off track asking some other questions, but.
well, something I think that is important part of this conversation is that, and we've kind of hinted at it, was that for psychedelics experience really to be effective over time for the addicted population, it really needs to find itself embedded within some kind of structured framework. So we've hinted about some of the recovery fellowships, which can be very supportive as a container for the personal work that needs to be done. And so, and there are different ways to do that. 12 steps works well, CBT, motivational interviewing, and the different adaptations and related therapeutic paths. But I think I had experienced this, and I know Kevin hinted at this, sometimes the psychedelic experience can give this feeling like I am better now. And it really takes a little bit more work than that. And I think, so for me, 12 steps was a very, very powerful, straightforward, no nonsense kind of framework. And in 12 steps, for those that are not familiar, there are some of the steps are what we would call reflection steps, and some are action steps. So when we have a reflection, let's say an insight or an epiphany from a psychedelic experience, there's often one of the steps in the 12 that will encourage us to take action based on whatever that epiphany was. And so that was how I personally was able to repair my relationship with other human beings and with, you know, society at large, with myself, with my higher power. And so that for me was what really gave an enduring quality to these last nearly 11 years of my life, was putting that visionary power in the service of these very practical actions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And something comes up, I guess, within the 12-step communities, like, you know, can people bring these experiences to different groups? And I know that's been challenging. You know, you're saying like bringing this insight in and maybe sharing it, but like, can people typically do that without feeling like maybe shameful of like, I've had this experience?
I would personally, I've never done it in an open meeting, simply because it's somewhat controversial. Somewhat is like an understatement. But in order to kind of keep the decorum of a particular meeting, it's just the amount of chattering that would go on around that. It makes it not fruitful to do that. But what I have noticed is, while respecting the space of a meeting, the after meeting and the dialogue and conversations that go on, there's a growing number of us that see no problem with these two things being allies to one another. And I haven't been shamed yet in all the years that I've been clean. I know there's been people that raise their eyebrows. They learn of what I do. You know, people talk through the grapevine or whatever. But I think nobody has told me straight face to face that, hey, man, what you're doing is wrong. Because a lot of the people, especially the people I got clean with, saw me when I entered the rooms. They saw the mess that my life was. And really, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I just kind of let my walk be my talk. And the evidence should speak for itself. And at least that's kind of my approach to that question, or how
my experience with it is similar in a large extent, but I think this touches on like a key motivator to some of the work that Todd and I have been doing lately. When I left Mexico after my ibogaine treatment, I had an open case in New York State, so I had a lot of what they call external accountability motivators to stay on a straight and narrow path. So part of my rules, more or less, for living in a sober living environment in South Florida were not only, in order to remain eligible to still live in that halfway house, I had to attend 100 meetings in 100 days. I had to get a sponsor. I had to actively be working through the steps with that sponsor. I was regularly drug tested there, just for the halfway house. Then for the drug court out of New York, they allowed me to complete the program in Florida, which meant I had to go to outpatient 3 times a week, in addition to the meetings I had to go to nearly every day. At the outpatient clinic, I was drug tested. I was also seeing a personal therapist at the time. So I had my entire life for a 10-month period was like all 12-step based recovery all the time, which never in a million years would I have imagined me like as a card carrying member of one of those fellowships. And the one internal motivator that I felt was carrying me through all of those things that I had some resistance towards was, as a psychedelic enthusiast and a MAPS supporter for many years and an aspiring researcher myself, I enrolled in the MAPS sponsored observational trial for ibogaine use in opioid detoxification. So I was finally able to provide good data as my only contribution to MAPS sponsored research at the time where my life was at. So I was heavily motivated. I even remember having the option of providing a urine test versus a hair test. And I was like, well, a hair test, you can see way more. So I'm going to volunteer to opt for the hair test to provide, again, stronger data. So with that being said, all I really wanted to talk about in my first 30 days of meetings was this ibogaine experience that I had just gone through, because I had nowhere else to turn to that. I would speak once a month to the investigator of this trial. But aside from that, all of the small talk that I was having with the people that I met in these meetings were, oh, what detox did you go to? What was your drug of choice? How did you get clean? And any time I opened up about the unique way that I didn't go to a methadone program, I didn't go to a traditional detox, I went to Mexico. Oh, really? What was that like? So the conversations, the meeting after the meeting that I would encounter with people just making small talk just became demoralizing, because I would get responses from people like, whoa, ibogaine, that sounds like something I would love to do. And I'm thinking nobody goes up to a cancer patient and says, oh, the chemotherapy you did sounds awesome. I would have loved to have done that. Because that's really what it was like. I was a medical patient looking for a medical treatment and receiving it. It wasn't, there were positive elements to the experience, but it wasn't something I wanted to repeat anytime soon.
Right.
So feeling like I was handcuffed from just a basic response to an attempt at small talk eventually led me to just withdrawing and not speaking at all about this ibogaine experience. And I didn't internalize any shame for it, but it was kind of a dangerous separation for me to feel like I had something to hide. And fortunately, I talked and processed this a lot in my private therapist sessions, and he was very supportive of my experience. But over the years, I had to continue to attribute my spiritual awakening to this origination in my ibogaine experience, as kind of reawakening something in me that I thought I had lost. And it was a really important thing. I couldn't, I'd be invited to speak for my 1-year anniversary, and it's a key element of my story that I felt incapable of sharing in that context. So by the time I found out about a group of people in New York City who were meeting specifically to talk about plant medicines in their recovery, I couldn't wait to participate in that, even if it was a room of 5 people, because finally I had like-minded individuals with shared experiences. And that started this process of discovering an opportunity really to provide a new framework for people in 12-step communities, which I would argue are probably the largest mutual aid group of supported peer-to-peer recovery from substance use disorders in the world, really. I mean, and that's not to say that it's the best, but it's definitely the most active and prevalent community of people. So we really touched on something that I think was crucial. And by 2017, when Todd and I met at the MAPS conference, I hosted a community forum at the tail end of the main 3-day, or maybe even more than 3 days, with pre-conference workshops and all that. So like right after the closing plenary, there was a community gathering for psychedelics in recovery. I expected there to be like 3 or 4 people because it was an exhausting weekend. We had like 60 people packed in this room.
Wow.
And tons of people interested in bringing this back to their communities or learning how to stay connected online. So we decided to create this online community and meeting space for people to gather, which, as you can imagine, the current state of affairs with what's been going on with COVID-19 and a lot of in-person meetings being canceled or moving online, it is a really amazing kind of position for us to be in, to invite a lot more people that can have access to these types of supports. And we're getting tremendous like resonance with people, and it just continues to be something that, again, this like individual internal navigation that I went through and that Todd went through, many others have gone through as well. And yeah, so it's just very exciting. Obviously I can speak a lot about it because it's something I'm really passionate towards these days.
Yeah, that's really awesome, and I'm glad you're creating that space. Would you guys mind sharing more about that work? We're kind of getting at an hour, so it'd be good to touch on that and then enter into question and answers.
Do you mean about the Project New Day work or psychedelics in recovery?
Yeah,
Okay,
psychedelics in recovery and what you guys are doing with some of this
well,
online format. And
in fact, I mean, we're just trying to strengthen, since there's a growing number of people that are coming to the conclusion that there are natural allies between psychedelic altered states and, like in our case, we were explicitly 12-step oriented, and that so there's a natural alliance here. And as growing number of people are coming to that, we feel the need to not only broaden the online community, but also our desire is to see this sort of propagate itself in in-person meetings, because we feel, for one thing, there's deeper limbic resonance in in-person meetings, and there's a greater amount of interpersonal communication, which is inspiring. But I think our goal or our aspiration is to see the framework that PIR offers begin to, that it would be available all over. And I mean, that's our goal. And we've been both working with this new foundation in California called Project New Day, which is helping us to, especially in this embryonic stage that we find ourselves in PIR, is trying to help us advance that infrastructure so that we can help as many people as we can. And yeah, it's really exciting. Yeah,
since 2017, we shifted to being largely online. It just became kind of untenable to expect a very slow word of mouth growing fellowship to increase in, based only really in New York City, which I'm sure others were as well in their own places, but it made a lot more sense to shift online as we attracted people from all over the country and really the world, depending on how the time zones work out with being able to meet with us. But yeah, I think we kind of have opted lately to look at what we're trying to establish with psychedelics and recovery as a title for a fellowship, as being kind of our model for how to replicate this on the ground in individual communities. And, you know, it's obviously not a requirement. It's our suggested approach, which we find resonates with a certain type of person. And we have our website, which is kind of slowly becoming our gathering place for new foundational formats and inspiration and different resources. That's psychedelicsinrecovery.org. Just a very simple few tabs to look at, largely reading material. Maybe this recording will live there as well eventually, but we want to facilitate an opportunity for people who are interested to meet others like them in their own places. And depending on the types of directions this goes, I definitely see a lot of potential for working closely with some of the clinical researchers and being an available integration tool for them. And it opens up a lot of questions about the history of 12-step fellowships and maybe some of the misguided approaches, or maybe some of the antiquated language and feelings of stigmatization that has prevented people from like really accessing the group, because 12-step programs are not professional organizations. They're not bound by strict training guidelines. They're a peer-to-peer mutual aid group. So any lay person could base their experience off of a number of things that aren't evidence-based, that are very anecdotal and may not even make sense for another person. So unfortunately, it would have been very easy for me to have turned away immediately from the rooms based on my experience of feeling handicapped about talking about my ibogaine experience. Had I done that and not sort of been forced by those external measures to see things through, I wouldn't have discovered a whole world of nuances that could be molded better to fit my like ideologies and my biases. And with patience and selective like introductions, I would meet the right people that wouldn't give judgment or snarky comments in response to my experience. So I was so sensitive at an early state and so socially debilitated by the last 2 years of my like active addiction, really interacting only with my dealer every few days is my only positive social interaction. Everything else I tried to avoid. So imagine going from that a week later to now entering a room full of strangers and attempting to make friends and connections. Like it's very ripe for opportunities to be scared away. But fortunately, sticking it through, I learned about a lot of nuances. I learned about a lot of 12-step like offshoot groups that have branched out from some of the original programs that have built in more nuance. A lot of the more like behavioral addiction aligned programs recognize that it's impossible to have sustained abstinence from eating disorders. It's unrealistic to expect people who struggle with sex addiction to abstain and be celibate for the rest of their lives. So there is a built-in precedent for there being a spectrum of self-defined sobriety or recovery or whatever the terminology that identifies and resonates most with people. So often the time I feel spent on kind of explaining all of the disclaimers and qualifications about what makes us different, what we totally understand about people's reservations about 12-step groups and 12-step language, and that kind of approach to addiction. Like, trust me, we've gone through many of those same reservations ourselves. So if you feel them, I can almost guarantee you that one of us has felt them, and we can share how we either transcended that, looked beyond that, or let it go, or you know what, we invite you to accept none of it, and we still welcome you and are here for you anyway.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's kind of the best kind of established guidance I can offer anybody, whether they have experience in those programs or not.
Awesome. Thank you.
I
Anything
was
that
just
you
going
want
to
to
say,
add, Todd?
yeah, I felt really blessed because I had a sponsor early on. I had court supervision when I got clean and sober. I was living in my mom's basement, so I had that constraint on my practical life. And there was an expectation that my life would begin to change in a meaningful way. Otherwise, I was going to be asked to not live there anymore. But it also turned out serendipitously that my sponsor saw the good work that was happening, and he just encouraged me. He said, look, I'm the only person that you need to share this with. I saw you come in, you had track marks on your neck, and you were a mess. And now you're not that guy. And in time, as you keep walking, being patient, you'll get the opportunity to share with more people one-on-one, privately, and that will gradually make you feel more and more connected. So, because people will feel sometimes a sense of dissonance, like Kevin was hinting at, dissonance of being in a room where you feel like you can't tell the full truth, right? And so my sponsor's message to me was simply rest in the truth of your own experience as you begin to change. Be patient, and and you'll see how things will turn out, and your relationships will begin to expand, and you will feel more and more comfortable. And I found that to be absolutely true.
It's awesome. Anything you guys want to wrap up here before we switch over to some questions?
I just want to acknowledge that for those that are messaging on the chat and on the Q&A, I have been doing what I can to follow our discussion, obviously, and being mindful of what's coming up. So I'm anticipating Kyle is going to field us some of those questions that have been brought in. But for those of you who may be wondering, I have been seeing them come in.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Let's see. Does iboga treatment help with kratom dependence, depression, and anxiety?
I don't know specifically about applications for kratom dependence. Kratom is definitely unique as a opiate, and its effects on different receptor types than are for most like morphine derivatives. I know there's more activity, and the simplest way for me to answer that is I don't know exactly, and I don't think there's been a tremendous amount of research. I'm sure there have been people that various clinics that provide ibogaine or iboga have probably encountered this more so recently.
Actually,
yeah, go ahead, Todd.
Back in 2017, I was down visiting an ibogaine clinic, and I met a guy there that was there to treat his kratom addiction, which had escalated to where he was taking whatever gargantuan amount he was taking. So, yeah, and he had gone there a couple of times, and a couple of other people mentioned that they had friends that sought out ibogaine for the detox phase off of heavy kratom use. Yes.
I'll just add, unfortunately, my relapse in late 2016 was initiated by experimentation with kratom. I can't obviously blame it on that, but I had a very, if you're curious to read more of my story, I'm happy to share some writings that I've done to reflect on that. But I would caution a little bit among people in recovery experimenting with kratom or any like opioid-like substance. If you have that same spot in your brain that I have, that just anytime an opiate-like thing enters my blood, it awakens a part in myself that is hard to quiet.
I think, yeah, people that have opiate use disorder should be very careful around that plant. And also, I probably also those with alcohol use disorder, because there are some, sometimes there's comorbid instances of alcohol abuse disorder or alcohol use disorder and opiate use disorder. A lot of people I know that were sort of on the merry-go-round of alcohol, back to opiates, back from opiates to alcohol. And so I would say kratom might be problematic for them too.
Yeah, I see Tony here says, I warn people all the time with experimenting with kratom. Legal does not mean safe. And yeah, I know some people in my life that have switched over to it, and it's still a daily crux. And, I hear them all the time saying, I just want to get off of this. But I mean, it feels like the safer option right now, but I also realize how dependent I am on it as well. So
I've heard of people utilizing it to come off of Suboxone, and they find that preferable. I mean, and I was on Suboxone once myself, and I was taken off when I was in prison, which definitely sucked. And so,
oof.
And I was also on methadone 5 different times over the course of 20 years. But so if I would have had access to kratom, not even really knowing much about it from firsthand experience, I probably would have opted for the step down onto something like that.
Yeah.
And then, so I think there's practical usefulness, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, again, I pointed at some of the ways that our treatment for various addictions are severely limited. I can imagine the appeal of being able to order a medicine yourself online, have it shipped directly to your house rather than wake up every day and stand on the methadone line, or make sure you don't miss your appointment with your doctor to refill your Suboxone prescription, or deal with pharmacists who are looking at you a certain way when you go to fill your prescription. So I am in no way demonizing people who take a more self-directed approach to their own relationship with medicines for healing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. See, Julian says, thank you for sharing, guys. You talked about shame and guilt. How much of these emotions were drivers of your addiction? And did overcoming these emotions with psychedelics help you stay sober?
Todd and I were just talking about that yesterday, actually. And it points to, I think, a comment that I saw also earlier about stigmatizing language. And I see Darlene shared the Faces and Voices of Recovery resource there. And I guess the one thing that I can speak to my experience about that question and that comment is, it's very easy for me to point to a lot of 12-step literature and find things that would be very stigmatizing to people, or references to moralistic behavior that people would not resonate with. And I totally understand and acknowledge all of those things. The only difference for me, I think, is with respect to emotions as drivers of my addiction. I mean, I never experienced a severe sexual, emotional, physical trauma growing up. I certainly have had traumatic experiences in a way that I never really aligned with a progression towards addiction. And having read a lot of work that went into the fact of underscoring trauma as a heavy predictor of later addiction, I always reflected wondering, where is the trauma in my life that I can blame on why I became an addict? And fortunately, I don't spend too much time dwelling in that realm as a person like in ongoing recovery now. But in terms of the way those types of emotions drove continuing my addiction, the lack of opportunity to process those feelings was what I was attempting to maintain as an active drug addict. If I felt guilty in the morning for stealing $50 from my mom's purse, 2 hours later, as long as I was high, I no longer had to feel that guilt.
Mm-hmm.
So at the peak of active addiction, emotions and feelings are the enemy. And all of the solutions and decisions I look to make are short-term, temporary, fleeting, and always marginally successful. So by the time I managed to finally escape and arrest the pattern of addiction and had to be left alone to confront those feelings, it sucked terribly. And I had to commit to the fact that I needed to sit there with that, having really no opportunity to run out the door and score to get away from it. And if it weren't for that prolonged period of looking directly at those feelings, I don't know if I would have been heavily motivated to seek relief from that in a different way. I could easily have seen it gone the other way and have guilt and shame be drivers of relapse and of disconnect and all those things. But fortunately, my story took a different direction.
Yeah, I would say that I've worked with some people that do, that I could safely say some of their addiction does come from early trauma. I was like Kevin, though. I had a fairly regular middle class upbringing without any real traumatic elements. Most of my pain and guilt was self-created. The longer and the harder I went with my lifestyle, the more things that I was trying to run from. It became like the snake trying to eat his tail. I was literally trying to escape from in my case, the self-created mess I had made out of my life. And it was really painful. But that said, some people for sure are going to feel shame because of things that have happened to them. And so I think each person brings a unique story to the process of recovery. And I think we need to honor all of them and be as sensitive as we can. I want to say really quickly, since I had been court-ordered to treatment many times before I actually got clean, when I'm still in the addicted state, I often tried to, I projected outwards. I said that groups were making me feel guilty when actually I was guilty of things. And I was trying to hang my hat on exterior factors when, at least in the case of my own personal life, most of my problems were of my own making. And the ayahuasca helped me come to terms with those. And ayahuasca is not, a lot of tears happen with ayahuasca. But I found them to be healing tears. And so I was able to come to terms with the mistakes of my past and ask for forgiveness, to grant forgiveness. And that was the transformative, those were transformative moments, I think.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all that, guys. Let's see. Cynthia says, any thoughts about the effectiveness of ibogaine followed by 5-MeO DMT?
I know that has become I wouldn't know about very common, but a common enough modality for different clinics to use. I don't have personal experience with it, but I remember reflecting after my ibogaine treatment with the clinic provider that I said, I really wish I could experience, sorry, I really wish I could experience a peak flood dose of ibogaine without having to be kicking. So I could give full conscious, clear attention to it. So I imagine if I were to go to a clinic today and receive a detox with ibogaine, and then a few days later or a week later having a 5-MeO DMT experience would be like a tremendous benefit for that. So I have a lot of pros and cons feelings about kind of flooding very powerful drugs at people in a short period of time at a very vulnerable state.
Yeah.
And I would be careful about approaching anything like that too hastily and without real careful considerations for a lot of different reasons. And I trust people to make kind of their own choices, but at the same time, the clinic and treatment providers that exist outside the United States and even in the underground are operating in an unregulated market. So they are really kind of inventing their protocols as they go along, and a lot of things can go wrong in that scenario, but at the same time they're offering something that people are seeking, and I think for many people they've found it to be helpful.
I think with respect to 5-MeO, I think in 12-step parlance, it would be a step 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves, because for many people, it is an overwhelmingly immersive experience. It was for me. And so I would just advise, though, a lot of restraint, because even though it's not per se addictive in that it doesn't interact with the brain's reward system in a dysregulating way, it's such an amazing experience that people could be, I've seen people become fascinated with the altered state occasioned by the toad medicine. And so I would suggest that people in recovery, they do it maybe once or twice in their lifetime as a sort of a jump start to the rest of the process.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. I guess on the topic of different substances, Ashley just asked here in the chat, what's your opinion on cannabis in recovery?
I don't personally use it myself. I mean, obviously it does have a much lower addiction profile, but I see some people that have issues with it. So I personally don't use it myself. But then I think each person, with respect to that specific plant, everybody has to make their own decision. It's in such a, I encourage people, if I work with them 12-step or in a 12-step way, I ask them, why don't you just not smoke for a year? And after we work through all the steps, and if you want to revisit it and maybe you can have a relationship with it, why don't you do that? But for now, why don't we see what it's like to just be, off of it?
Yeah.
In some ways I view, and I want to answer this in from what we've discussed as psychedelics in recovery, as a group that has members that may be navigating different definitions of recovery for themselves. We've kind of acknowledged that in some ways we run into a similar situation with people's use of cannabis and in some sense microdosing, even though there's a ton of differences. I feel like in large part, we want to kind of recognize that people's own best barometers for individual recovery is themselves. And obviously, we hope to help people remain accountable, help to provide an alternate perspective, and in different types of work, maybe advise them or suggest otherwise in that. But we really set up a system where if people want to acknowledge their own self-defined sobriety or self-defined recovery, then the actions that they take, as Todd has been pointing out with the reflections his sponsor made, it's see how the direction that your life is going. And if your life continues to improve, then obviously you're doing more good than bad. But there's other, that's our position on it. There's other 12-step groups that, see any kind of mood or mind altering substance use as being a key to a relapse, or even they don't even want to weigh into it to an extent where it's deemed an outside issue. But we want to take the position where we're kind of inviting a variety of different perspectives given our nuanced understanding.
Right.
Yeah.
I see that Lila was asking about detoxing and cannabis is helping with the pain. I mean, there are totally legitimate times to use cannabis for pain. I remember I've known people that actually help to mitigate some of the pain from opiate withdrawal using cannabis and they found help with it. And so I think we just try to avoid black and white thinking with that plant. Although, like I said before, I don't use it myself for a variety of reasons. I want to reflect that example. I'm still addicted to coffee, though, I will admit. So that's the one caveat substance for 12-step groups.
Yeah. And I guess I would comment, I'm not in the recovery community, so take it with a grain of salt, but stuff like what Daniel McQueen's doing at Medicinal Mindfulness, using cannabis in a conscious way for inner exploration, maybe that could have some benefit. But again, I guess it kind of comes back to your use, and is it, as you said, are you bettering your life, or is it kind of bringing you back down? But it's been really interesting watching some of this conscious cannabis use start to emerge, and people creating more ceremony around it and more intention around how they're viewing that plant.
I think some people might have a hard time with that. I worked with a guy recently that was very alcohol and opiate oriented, but he was also a cannabis overuser, and he found himself in a circle that was using sacramental cannabis. And for him, some people just can't do it without it starting a whole But yeah. So I've seen people that should never use it.
Yeah.
And then
totally.
some people like Lilac here mentioning being detoxed from pain meds, benzos, and alcohol. Hey man, if weed can help you stop doing those things, then by all means smoke. It's far less virulent than OxyContin and Xanax in the morning.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
Let's see. Tracy asks, can you speak to the folks who feel that they want to do their own psychedelic therapy for addiction? Not everyone has access to a ceremony or finding a sitter/guide. Obviously, there are risks, but I like to hear thoughts on way people are experiencing addiction can have sovereignty over their health and healing.
That's such a hot potato.
I know.
Yeah, and believe me, Tracy, I get asked that question a lot, and I have people emailing me a lot, and depending on someone's situation, I wouldn't want to point people in one direction or the other. Like, I'm a huge harm reduction proponent and recognize that humans have their own volition, and I would rather provide ways to set people with the right information and education than tell them you shouldn't be doing this and leave it at that. So there are definitely ways to access resources to keep people safe and minimize their risk of harm. And I know desperate people looking into things in the middle of the night and coming across a very promising avenue of treatment that they've never tried before or heard of, want to consider that for their situation if lots of other things have failed. So, we might not have the time to wait until psilocybin becomes an FDA approved medication to treat, my alcohol use disorder. There are a couple of things that I would much more strongly caution people against doing, such as ibogaine on one's own without any, even a trusted sitter being with you, I don't think is enough. I think a trained medical professional who understands a lot of the potential side effects of ibogaine and the contraindications and the necessary assessments for pre-existing heart conditions and things like that need to be considered before approaching that. And there are resources for those things. I know the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance has a minimum standards of care guideline that is designed for medical professionals to as a guidebook to look at when working with clients who may be doing ibogaine for treatment. But I'm not a medical professional. I don't have emergency medicine training, so I'm definitely not qualified to tell people what to do. But I would just very, very strongly caution people from doing their due diligence and not simply discovering that they can order something online and then they're off to the races trying it for themselves. Please take time to consider all sorts of avenues, and echo the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance.
Anything that you want to add there, Todd? I know it's a tough question to navigate.
No, I'm good.
Cool. Benjamin, I see that you have a question that's kind of on the similar, so I guess we'll leave it at that one as well. But this is another one by Benjamin. Regarding 12 steps approach, other than noting the early research from the 50s, which is very valuable, how do you get beyond the assumption of many people thinking, yeah, 12 steps is old tech, but the plant medicine is new tech? How do you encourage people towards understanding how 12 steps is and how the medicines can lead to deeper practice in the 12-step path?
Todd, I'm going to let you start that one while I go to the bathroom. And yeah.
Okay. Well, when the message is carried from person to person, I have found I've been in situations or in settings where, let's say in the immediate afterglow of an ayahuasca ceremony, let's say where I will literally conduct a small little AA meeting. We'll read out of the literature. I'll have a one-on-one or a small group conversation. And one of the most frequent responses I get from people that were doubters is almost invariably, "Oh, I see what you're trying to show me here." All of a sudden, the process seems to make sense. And I know that's not a very exact scientific answer, but I think most of the prejudice is towards the old school moribund 12 steps can be overcome in the light of the psychedelic experience itself. At least that was the experience that I had, and that's the experience that most of the people have that I work with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and even though the brave new world of plant medicines offers all these possibilities, a central fact remains that a lot of people that go to South America to treat their addiction do return home, and without some kind of framework of integration that is somewhat structured in the way 12 steps are, many of them do relapse. And so I think sometimes it's trial and error. I don't know. I just try to do my best to carry both messages as gracefully and welcomingly as I can. I'm not here to preach plant medicine. I'm not here to preach 12 steps. I just like to offer them in a way that's an invitation for people to at least explore how they might work together. I don't know.
Awesome. Did you want to chime in on that one, Kevin?
I love the 12 steps is old tech, but the plant medicine is new tech, kind of new age mantra that we see a lot, that with like corporate interests and investors coming into the like psychedelic space and viewing it as the new opportunity. I mean, plant medicine is far older than the 12 step, like the way that 12 steps are laid out. But the interesting thing is both of those concepts are very old. And like there's no new information in the 12 step programs in terms of spiritual teachings and lessons and guidebooks to living that there hadn't existed for hundreds, if not longer, years in other spiritual traditions. So there's a great book called The Spirituality of Imperfection, which focuses a lot on that and how the 12 steps kind of rediscovered a spiritual framework for a living, obviously in a like heavily Judeo-Christian approach, given the kind of Protestant leanings that Bill W. and Dr. Bob were affiliated with prior to that. But they molding the experiential and healing processes of plant medicine and psychedelics with a long history of ceremonial use in the traditional context, as well as like the spiritual leanings of the 12 steps. It's like baking a cake with the perfect ingredients.
Right. I put it in an essay that I wrote last year that the psychedelic experience is like the engine and the 12 steps of the transmission. So to get where you want to go, you have to put these two things together. And then so 12 steps become the vehicle for all that power in a very practical, meaningful way.
Yeah, and maybe this last question here is kind of like on the tail end of that. So Alaska asks, I'm curious if y'all could speak on what sort of integration you had after the psychedelic experiences that led to sobriety, and if you feel that was an important aspect of the impact those experiences had.
Well, yeah, for me, the 12 steps were the integration. So, I mean, there's the fellowship, which are meetings, but then for me, most importantly, was the sort of systematic dismantling of myself through the 12-step process that was the integration. And so working with another person, my sponsor, work one-on-one, that was how I integrated it.
Awesome. Anything that you wanted to add there, Kevin, about integration?
No, not really. I think I just echo that, and the working the 12 steps with a sponsor or some kind of guided framework is a perfect opportunity to integrate a psychedelic experience and an overall like psychedelically fueled catalyst for individual recovery, which is the same that I've found. I don't think I would have appreciated the variety of ways that a spiritual awakening could have emerged in me had I not been exposed to my personal affiliation for spirituality through my use of psychedelics.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I noticed that we're at time. So I just want to say thank you for joining today on the webinar and being so open and sharing your personal experience. It's been really awesome just to hear both of your journeys, and I think, you know, really helpful for other people to hear that as well. So just, yeah, really thank you for being so open and about your experiences and your journey here. If people want to support you anyway, people want to learn more about your work, where can people find your work? How can people support you? How can people get involved in psychedelics and recovery?
They can check out our website, psychedelicsinrecovery.org.
Cool.
Yeah, we have so in terms of support, I think the best way is just if there are people in your work, if you work with people with addiction, or if you know people with addiction that you think might resonate with this message, please like share this information with them, share our website with them. We have our online PIR meetings weekly at this point, given the COVID-19 situation. But in terms of any other kind of support, we really don't ask for that. We do, people might notice that our website has a donation page, but that is really designed to help with expenses in a self-supporting way. So we really don't ask for contributions for people outside of those who identify as members of our group.
But that's certainly a good place for people that are interested to come to network with us. And as that, you know, that's what our aspiration is to see that network grow. And then, yeah. Would it be okay too if we shared, both Kevin and I have written some articles about our own personal experience. Would it be okay if we posted them on your site and people could read those?
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, if you're open to sharing that. Yeah.
I mean, those materials are also available at the psychedelicsinrecovery.org page. But it might be, you know, just a shorter.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. You can send them over and we can get them up there. Yeah, thanks for the offer.
Great. Yeah, we're trying to facilitate ways for us to connect outside of just our meetings. So we have a private Facebook group, Psychedelics in Recovery. You can request to join that. We started a Slack channel that I'll share the access information to, and it's a slow growing network. It's not a totally vibrant space just yet, but as more people become attracted to this community, we're hoping to see it grow a lot.
Yeah, awesome.
Thanks so much, Kyle.
Todd, Kevin, thank you so much. Until next
Thank you.
time, and thanks everybody for joining. I hope everybody's staying safe, healthy, and hope you enjoy the day.
Thank you.